Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Steve Barrows, chief executive officer at the Acton Institute. And today we'll be talking about entrepreneur and pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai. Jimmy was found guilty this morning in a Hong Kong court. We're recording this on Monday. It's sort of a landmark national security case in Hong Kong. The New York Times reported this morning, officials in Hong Kong and mainland China had cast Mr. Lai, 78, as a mastermind of anti-government demonstrations that engulfed the former British colony in 2019, posing a serious challenge to Beijing's authority. Prosecutors said that he colluded with foreign governments, including the United States, to target China and Hong Kong with sanctions. Mr. Lai pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy to collude with foreign forces, an offense that can be punished by up to life in prison, and not guilty to a count of conspiracy to publish seditious materials in Apple Daily, the now shuttered Chinese-language newspaper he founded in 1995. On Monday, this Monday, a court found him guilty on all 3 counts. The court has set 4 days aside for a hearing over his sentencing, starting January 12th, and it will be announced, quote-unquote, as soon as possible, said Esther Tao, one of the 3 judges presiding over the hearing. Steve, this is not a great occasion to be welcomed back to Acton Line, but thank you for making time on your schedule to discuss this very important case.
Yeah, my pleasure, Dan. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
I guess let's start with a little bit about just who Jimmy Lai is and sort of the nature of his longstanding relationship with us at Acton.
Yeah, so Jimmy, of course, is Chinese, and he grew up under Mao's communist China, and at the age of 12 was a stowaway who escaped to Hong Kong, and then from nothing, literally nothing, began to work his way up, working in a garment factory and eventually building his own clothing business, which was an amazing success. He is by nature an entrepreneur and was someone that had longed for freedom and instinctively knew the importance of freedom. So he's
it's something. The second phase of his career after the manufacturing and fashion career was to start Apple Daily,
That's
newspaper, right. And this is in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square. Jimmy, freedom was so important to his own life and to the sort of opportunities he got in then British-administered Hong Kong is something he wanted all Chinese people to enjoy, and founded Apple Daily.
That's right.
As a pro-democracy, pro-freedom outlet in Hong Kong.
Exactly. You know, as you point out, I think the June of 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre was a turning point for Jimmy, and he just saw the evil of the Communist Party's suppression of true human freedom. And so that, as you pointed out, he started a couple of publications, one Next Daily and then Apple Daily, and he had shifted eventually all of his efforts to the media because he understood that freedom of speech and freedom of information was vital to human freedom overall. And so he dedicated the rest of his life to promoting that aspect of human freedom and, in fact, all of human freedom. So he was really a spokesman for the dignity of the person and knew that it was vital to be able to speak out because Hong Kong didn't really have any other newspapers that were not as effectively overseen by Beijing. Yeah. And so the Apple Daily newspaper was that one poke in the eye, as it were, to say, no, we're going to have a voice and we're going to have this in Cantonese. It was published in Cantonese, which was his language, and as opposed to Beijing's other papers, which are largely Mandarin. And so I think that was really critical for Hong Kong as a whole, but it certainly didn't make the Chinese Communist Party happy.
Yeah. Cantonese is historically the predominant language in southern China. Hong Kong is, of course, a hub of this language. Jimmy has been in prison now for a while. There was politically motivated charges back in 2022 that he was convicted of on fraud charges relating to a lease in Apple Daily. This is largely
Yeah.
concocted, politically
Right.
motivated. That carried a 5+ year sentence, but these new charges under the new national security laws are much more severe. Many of them carrying the potential for a life sentence. How has Jimmy's treatment in prison been, and how is his health doing? Because these have both been concerns throughout this whole trial process. Is Jimmy's treatment and then his own health? He's 78 years old.
Yes, that's right.
And struggles with diabetes.
Yeah, so of course, I'm hearing these things largely third hand. And in fact, Jimmy was friends and acquaintances with our co-founders, Father Robert Sirico and Chris Morin. And so, as we understand it, he has been struggling. As you said, he's 78 years old, has some other health conditions. He's effectively living in solitary confinement and is just not having the kind of access to the kinds of things you would need to have good health. And so it's unfortunate because he's languishing there in prison, and yet his perseverance and his continual standing, he continues to have the convictions he had when he entered prison. And so as much as the Chinese Communist Party wants to break him, he has proven to be resilient even in the midst of struggles with his health that you might expect at his age.
Yeah. Before we move on to more of the details of this results of this latest verdict and talk about prospects for sentencing, I wanted to talk about, you mentioned Chris and Father Robert have both been long friends and acquaintances of Jimmy. The Acton Institute produced a documentary film years ago called Call of the Entrepreneur, in which Jimmy Lai's story, amazing story of the rise of his clothing business and Apple Daily, is sort of chronicled as one of the stories in the Call of the Entrepreneur.
That's right.
To talk about entrepreneurship and the role of entrepreneurship in society. What are some other dimensions of that relationship that began years and years ago?
Yes.
And has been a longstanding relationship.
So in addition to the chronicling that you described in the Call of the Entrepreneur, I think it's safe to say that Jimmy's faith journey has been a very important aspect of that. And of course, as a Catholic priest, Father Robert knows something about helping people in their journey. And so for those who aren't aware of that story, Jimmy married a devout Catholic. His wife is a devout Catholic, but he was really of no religious persuasion or conviction. But over time, he began to understand and see the importance of our origins, the big questions, right? And I think that he faithfully attended Catholic Mass with his wife and eventually became baptized. And so that's another aspect that's neat, when you think about our Acton emphasis on both freedom and virtue or freedom and religion. It's just epitomized in his own story, his own life story. He understood by his very nature the importance of freedom to human flourishing, and eventually he saw and mapped that to a faith journey.
Yeah. It's an incredible story in Call of the Entrepreneur. We also did another documentary about Jimmy after Jimmy's arrest and imprisonment called The Hong Konger.
That's right.
Yeah, could you share something?
Sure.
About
So
that?
it was great. I was involved in the production of The Hong Konger, and it's just one of those stories that I think points people to the importance of fighting for freedom, because freedom is something that we too often take for granted. So when Jimmy was, he had been harassed repeatedly over the years by Beijing, but eventually it came to a head, and they just when the 25-year anniversary, you might say, of the handover of Hong Kong from the United Kingdom to China. That was the time that they really put down the pressure and put him in prison. And as part of that, we wanted to chronicle his story and get the word out so that people understood that this is a cause that is not just his cause, but it's a cause the world needs to be behind. Because that's just one example, a journalist that's being suppressed and being persecuted and imprisoned for speaking about the truth of freedom. That's not something that China just wants to do for people in Hong Kong. That would be their ambition overall. They don't hold to the same values that has formed Western civilization. They see a one-party rule, one-party state as the be-all, end-all. They're an atheistic communist regime, and so we wanted to chronicle the story and get his word out, get his plight out. And so it was a labor of love, and it's free out on YouTube. It's been out there, has I think 5 million hits, and so we encourage people to go see that story.
Yeah. We will put a link to that in the show notes, of course. And part of the story there It's the story of Jimmy, of course, but it's also the story of Hong Kong
That's
and this
right.
transition. Hong Kong is what this handover was supposed to entail, and which legally it entails until 2042.
That's correct, yes.
Is that there is a sort of one country, two systems legal framework, one in mainland China, one in Hong Kong. That has been eroding.
Yes.
And particularly because of two national security laws, one imposed by Beijing in 2020, the other introduced by the Hong Kong government last year, change the terms of that deal.
Right.
And these are the sort of these are the laws which Jimmy is now being prosecuted under.
That's right.
Are these, since the handover, national security laws that have been enacted. This is one of the reasons that international critics doubt this trial's fairness.
Yes.
From a basic sort of rule of law perspective. These laws were passed sort of, and then Jimmy is being sort of retroactively prosecuted under this legal system.
Right. As you point out, so 1997 was the handover. For 50 years, they were to maintain and basically leave alone a one country, two systems approach, right? So, and as part of that, they began to incrementally dial back from that agreement as we outlined in that whole documentary. Mm-hmm. And then, as you point out, they have this new national security law, which is so sweeping in its condemnation of what they refer to as sedition, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, the jurisdiction that they would claim over people who are engaged in seditious behavior extends outside of Hong Kong as well. And so they would use that. Of course, it's such a wide thing that you could just drive a truck through it, right? I mean, anything could constitute sedition if they wanted to call it that, anything that they perceived to be threatening to the regime. And so in the end, they used that as a basis for putting Jimmy in prison, because they said, look, your Apple Daily, not only is it saying things against Beijing and is continually a poke in the eye, but they also claimed that any engagements he might have had, which they don't know the details of the conversations that he had with some of U.S. government officials, but they said this is proof that you're engaged in seditious activity because you're trying to get foreign governments to harm China and Hong Kong, which of course is not the case. He's just generically, like anybody else, advocating for freedom of Hong Kong and the original agreement that Beijing had signed up to back in 1997, which they've dialed back from.
Yeah. Jimmy does, however, have a network of support. We've talked about his wife, Teresa, already. Yes. He has sons who have been working for his freedom. Some of them reaching out to folks in different governments around the world, including the United States government, to advocate for Jimmy. And then also Cardinal Zen.
Yes.
And Cardinal Zen and his wife actually left together after this verdict was rendered. Could you tell a little bit about Jimmy's relationship with Cardinal Zen and his family network of support as well?
Yes. So as I understand it, when he became Catholic, he was very close to Cardinal Zen, who was the Archbishop of Hong Kong for many years and is older than Jimmy. I think he's in his mid-90s. And so Cardinal Zen, of course, has been a very strong voice for Jimmy and for the democracy movement within Hong Kong itself. And he has also been harassed by the government of Hong Kong for engaging in behavior that they say is, I don't know if they would put him under the sedition, but they protest what he has been doing in support of the democracy advocates. And so I think Jimmy and Cardinal Zen have always been very close. Cardinal Zen has been a strong voice and has continually gone back to the Vatican saying, look, we need to speak out about the plight of Hong Kongers and about the threat to people of faith in general. And so he's been really a very admirable voice for those who are fighting for liberty and religious freedom.
Yeah. Acton has sort of added its voice to this through the Hong Konger, of course, through Call the Entrepreneur. We've covered Jimmy's trials for a very long time. We've also this morning, we're recording this on Monday. This podcast will be released on Wednesday, but on Monday morning this week, we had a video statement from Father Robert that was released on the trial verdict. And Acton also issued a sort of institutional statement of support for Jimmy. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes. So, Father Robert, of course, is a very visible presence of Acton as president emeritus, had wanted to lend his voice to the plight of his friend. And so he spoke institutionally and then also from the heart about what a travesty of justice this is. And then Acton as a whole, we've long, just as you have mentioned, covered Jimmy's story and dating all the way back to the original Call the Entrepreneur video.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sent out a statement, again, condemning this unjust conviction. And irrespective of what happens from here, okay, he's been convicted. He will eventually have a sentencing. Frankly, they should let him go. He has already endured more suffering in prison than anybody who fights for freedom should ever have to endure. And so we again call for his release.
Yeah. We'll provide a link to that video as well as that statement in the show notes as well. This is a delicate moment in Hong Kong. The mood in Hong Kong is not good. This transition away from a one country, two systems has caused all sorts of problems for Hong Kong. There was recently an apartment complex fire last month that killed around 160 people. So this is a time in which the government of Hong Kong is under some criticism for not only these cooperating with the restriction of press freedoms, suppression of pro-democracy activists, but also just sort of failures of good governance in general. So there's and it's hard to tell in the sort of society that is, the information flow out of communist China is not always reliable.
Right.
But we do know there's a great deal of discontent in Hong Kong having to do with this and with other issues of governance in Hong Kong since the transition. There's also been a number of critics reporting in the New York Times, international critics. New York Times reported that Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council, which oversees its relations with Beijing, said that the verdict undermined the Hong Kong government's efforts to paint a better picture of the city. Quote, no amount of storytelling can cover up the fact that it suppresses freedom of speech and persecutes democracy advocates. Also, The Guardian reporting, the British Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper has also condemned this, saying, quote, the UK condemns the politically motivated prosecution of Jimmy Lai that has resulted in today's guilty verdict. Jimmy Lai has been targeted by the Chinese and the Hong Kong governments for peacefully exercising his right to freedom of expression. We continue to call for Mr. Lai's immediate release. The Australian government has said that it was deeply concerned with the verdict, while the EU has said the outcome was, quote, emblematic of the erosion of democracy and fundamental freedoms in Hong Kong, end quote. That's some reporting from The Guardian. We'll link to both the New York Times and The Guardian's coverage of this. There's been a lot of international outrage already.
Right. Well, it's interesting, as you point out, many governments have already condemned this conviction, and it is politically motivated. I don't think there's any question about that. Mm-hmm. One of the things you had mentioned earlier I want to highlight, because there's trouble within Hong Kong, there's some discontent over governance and other struggles that it's facing. But I think one of the things people don't realize is that Jimmy himself is even a polarizing figure within Hong Kong.
Yes.
Now, obviously, there were millions of people who marched. There's the Tiananmen Square vigil that they used to hold, which China has suppressed now. They don't allow that vigil to take place in Hong Kong anymore. So though he's a polarizing figure, what some people don't realize is that over the course of the years, especially since the 1997 agreement, mainland China has had and encouraged significant migration from the mainland into China. And over the course
into Hong Kong.
Into Hong Kong, yes. So over the course of a quarter-plus century, you've seen a shift in the composition of people who actually reside in Hong Kong. And many of those people who have migrated probably had already some generally positive dispositions towards Beijing. And so it's almost, you could say, a deliberate attempt by mainland China to change the composition of the people who comprise Hong Kong so that they become more favorable towards Beijing. And so, some might be surprised, well, how could it be that Hong Kong it looks at Jimmy as a polarizing figure? Well, I think part of it is because a lot of those individuals didn't really have those sensibilities to begin with. And so that could be a deliberate effort by China to make sure that Hong Kong becomes more favorable towards Beijing.
This is something that we've seen employed again and again in Xinjiang, in Western China, in Tibet, of course,
yes.
is a migration to ethnically Han, Mandarin speakers, to
right.
other regions of China in an attempt to sort of stifle civil
Yes.
society.
That's right.
Throughout China. Now, President Trump has appealed to Xi Jinping for Jimmy's release during an October meeting. There's been reports of this. There has been no, of course, movement on this. We don't know at
Right.
this point what President Trump, what the administration of the United States is not going to press for. What are things that folks should keep, that American citizens should keep an eye on and look for their government to be doing in the coming days?
Yes. Well, one thing I would say is I think there still needs to be pressure put on China to have him be released. So, and in fact, there could be an element of hope here where you have the conviction and then they say, the punishment is time served. We're going to release him, and maybe as part of a broader negotiation deal they have over trade or whatever the case may be. But allowing for a conviction as unjust as they may be, and a release with having had time served might be a way for Beijing to save face as part of a broader negotiation. I mean, we don't want the conviction, but there is hope to be had to say, look, let him go. We've made our voice known, and go from there.
Yeah. That sentencing will happen in January. We will be back here again to talk about that when that happens. In the meantime, I wanted to conclude a little bit. We've talked about the Hong Konger. If folks in the audience want to learn more, that is the absolute best way. There's excellent press coverage out today. There will continue to be great press coverage throughout the Western world about this. I'm very confident in this. But to get up to speed on not only what's going on with Jimmy, but what's going on in Hong Kong, because these two things are intimately related. This is the reason that Jimmy became active politically in these ways is because of what was going on in Hong Kong.
That's right.
And he wanted to stand up for the freedom, not only of himself. He had the means.
That's right.
If Jimmy Lai was a successful entrepreneur, was a billionaire, he did not have to go to prison.
That's right.
He chose to go to prison in solidarity with the folks of Hong Kong.
That's right.
And so we would ask all of you for prayers for Jimmy, prayers for his family, prayers regarding the sentencing, and prayers for all of the people around the world right now who are working for Jimmy's release.
That's right. Yep. And you can go to thehongkongermovie.com and find more information not only about the movie, but other things that are happening in Hong Kong and the latest updates on Jimmy.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us
Thank
for
you,
Acton
Dan.
Line. We hope next time we have you here, we will have happier news, but this is very important, and I'm so glad that you're able to join us and unpack this news for our audience today.
That's great. Pleasure to be here, and like you said, we're all praying for Jimmy's eventual release.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.